So, welcome to the Theology and Falsification, a symposium by Flew and Hare from 1971, when it was published. This is the Edexcel A-level in Religion, Philosophy and Ethics, and we're focusing on the first part of the anthology, which you need to be familiar with. So it's important that you've read it in order for you to access the series of lessons in this presentation that you will work through. And so we start by thinking a little bit about the context. It was an essay that was published by Antony Flew in collaboration with Richard Hare. Antony Flew's on the left and Richard is on the right. And we're referring to them, as often is the case with scholars, by their surname throughout. Now, this was a collaboration, and the first part focuses on Flew and Hare, but we also bring in Mitchell in the second part, which this particular video doesn't look at. That's in the second video. Now, Edexcel break it up into two anthologies, Flew with Hare and Flew with Mitchell. It's called Symposium, and this is a very old-fashioned word. It's a title of a work actually by Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, and it references an after-dinner friendly discussion over a drink, as the ancient Greeks often did. And so if we think a little bit about the context of Antony Flew, this 1971 essay between Flew and Hare starts with Flew explaining his falsification principle and what that means for religious language. Karl Popper initially introduced the idea of falsification so that we could improve the approach to scientific knowledge, and here Flew applies this approach to religion. Now, it is important that you have studied the topic of religious language to access some of the key concepts in the anthology here. Flew illustrates the problem of unfalsifiable religious language using the parable of the gardener. And now he then challenges Hare in the symposium to explain what would count as disproving the existence of a loving God. So let's start. Here you can see the paragraphs from the text, and the summary will be in blue. You should make a note of that. The questions that come up in the black boxes will help you with the 10-mark essay. And then further questions and further ideas will go beyond simply clarifying and illustrating the text to enable you to analyze it for the 20-mark essay and to think a little bit more critically about some of the things that Flew and Hare talk about. So here Flew begins with the parable of the gardener. It was taken from actually John Wisdom in 1944, and Flew alters it very uniquely to make his own point. So let's start by highlighting the following ideas in Flew's version of the parable of the gardener. Flew refers to two explorers, and this is really important because we're going to compare it in a moment with John Wisdom's version, the original. We also want to highlight the jungle. We also want to highlight the idea of in the clearing, and we also want to highlight when he mentions the skeptic despairing. He says it here, that the skeptic, at last, the skeptic despairs. And here we can see the version by John Wisdom. So what are the differences between Flew's parable and Wisdom's parable? Well, for example, first and foremost, the jungle was actually called a garden. There we go. The second thing is that the clearing that we just highlighted by Flew, according to Wisdom, this was a long neglected garden. So we can highlight that there. Now, when it comes to the skeptic was is the only reasonable one in Antony Flew's parable. Whereas for Wisdom, both of the people in this parable are considered to have reasonable ideas. And we can find that here. in the final paragraph, where it says, their different words now reflect no difference as to what they have found in the garden. So for Flew, the skeptic is the only one that has a reasonable approach to what they're discussing and the questions they're asking, whereas in Wisdom's parable, both of the people in it seem to have a reasonable approach. Now, going back to Flew's text here with his parable, his version, what does the clearing in the jungle, and we'll just re-highlight that, clearing in the jungle, what does that represent? Well, the clearing in the jungle represents the world around us. What do the flowers represent? There we can see there were growing many flowers. Well, the flowers represent order, beauty, goodness. Perhaps we might refer to this as qua-regularity, in which Paley saw in nature. This is perhaps where we would go back to the design argument from our AS knowledge. What do the weeds represent? There's also, as we can see highlighted here, many weeds. Well, the weeds represent disorder, suffering, and evil. This is perhaps a very clear link from AS knowledge to the problem of evil and suffering. Now, what does the explorer who believes in a gardener represent? Well, the explorer, as we can see here, that believes in the gardener, this is this one here, explorer who says some gardener must tend to this plot. This is the believer. This is the religious believer in Flew's parable. What does the gardener represent? Well, the gardener represents, in this case, God. And so the gardener is God. This is the one that they're thinking and talking about. One believes that the gardener is going to come and tend to the plot, and he's responsible, and the other one is skeptical about this. So what does Flew call the other explorer, and why? As we just mentioned, he calls the other explorer here the skeptic. And he calls him the skeptic because this explorer doubts things that aren't supported by the evidence. So perhaps we may call this person the atheist. Think of someone, for example, a skeptic like David Hume, who we visit a little bit later in the anthology. So why do the explorers set up tests, and what might they represent in history? Well, let's highlight the tests that we can find. The first one, they pitch their tents and they set a watch. That means they wait and watch to see whether the gardener appears, but no gardener's ever seen. And then we see a little bit later on, they set up barbed wire, a barbed wire fence. They electrify the barbed wire fence. They patrol it with bloodhounds, with dogs. Now, these are the different ways of trying to prove the existence of the gardener, or perhaps we may say the existence of God. None, however, of these tests are successful. They could represent events in history, like the Holocaust, which challenged the idea of an omnibenevolent God who intervenes in the world. So after each test fails, which we learn in the parable, what is the religious believer's response to this? Well, the religious believers don't give up on God, but they adjust their definition of God to explain his failure to intervene. In this case, in the parable, one of the explorers who believes that a gardener comes to tend the plot doesn't give up on the idea of the gardener, but adjusts their definition. Here we can see the text that explains this. And we see that here. Perhaps he is an invisible gardener, the believer says. The believer, however, is not convinced. And we see that here, yet still the believer is not convinced that despite all these tests that have falsified the idea that there was a gardener coming, it doesn't matter what test is done, the believer still is not convinced that there isn't a gardener. Now, what does the skeptic accuse the believer of doing here? Well, we can read this question that is made in the text. And this is where we read the skeptic saying, "What remains of your original assertion? How does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary one, or even from no gardener at all?" The atheist, or the skeptic in the parable, accuses the believer of believing in a God, or in this case a gardener, who is no different from an imaginary being, or not a being at all. Now, God doesn't seem to do anything here that can be disproved or contradicted in the eyes of the believer. Now, this parable shows how the falsification principle applies to religious language, and there's something that you could probably pick out yourself there. Religious belief starts out with the simple belief in a God who can be disproved. And this is what Flew believes, much like the Greek gods who lived on the top of Mount Olympus during the Hellenistic period. However, today, and you see the image there of Mount Olympus, you can climb up to the top of Mount Olympus and you can easily disprove this ancient myth in the Greek mythology world, that you can disprove the existence of all of those gods that they believed were on the top of Mount Olympus. However, religions like Judaism, Christianity, they have a God who is omnipresent everywhere. This development means that one cannot falsify the claim God exists. Now, what does Flew think about this? Well, Flew thinks that by making God unfalsifiable, as perhaps the development of religions have over the years, they have made their religious language simply meaningless. At least with the ancient Greek gods and the beliefs back then, today they are meaningful because, according to Flew, you can falsify them clearly. Now, how could a religious believer introduce religious experience here as a defense to this? And what would happen if Flew included that in his parable? Well, believers sometimes claim that God does appear to them. If Flew included that, it would mean that the gardener does appear to one of the explorers who could see him. Now, Flew ignores the idea of having religious experience as a defense. He doesn't introduce this or entertain this idea at all. But it is a worthy point for consideration. Now, there are really strong parallels here that you may notice between John Hick's parable of the celestial city and his views on having an epistemic distance. Let's see if we can explain them. If you remember the parable that you should have learned about, two travelers on a journey to the celestial city. One of them is a skeptic, one of them is a believer. Now, only one of them is going to be right at the end of the journey. There's a very obvious parallel there. And the idea that Hick has of the epistemic distance, which is about not having full knowledge of God for very good reasons, it makes sense why then we cannot perhaps see or know all things yet. It makes sense perhaps why the explorer in Flew's parable would still hold on to those beliefs about God. Because there's perhaps a conviction of an epistemic distance that yet we don't know all things yet, but we're growing towards them over time. So let's move on. Flew now interprets the parable of the gardener and explains what it shows about religious belief. He explains how religious belief dies the death by 1,000 qualifications. You're probably very familiar with hearing that phrase by now. So what does Flew mean by an assertion? He says what starts as an assertion. Well, an assertion is when a religious belief, if it starts out as an assertion, he's he's saying then that it believes that it contains some truth claim or a statement of fact. So he means religious belief starts out as an assertion. What does Flew say then about this religious assertion? Well, he says that it gets reduced step by step to an altogether different status. And it ends up as a picture preference, which simply means it ends up as being just simply in your imagination. Now remember that, because we revisit that particular phrase, picture preference, later on. How does Flew's parable then illustrate these ideas that he's got? Well, it says here, the skeptic says there is no gardener. The believer says there is a gardener, albeit invisible. Now, the explorer starts off believing in a physical gardener, but when this belief runs into difficulty, he ends up believing in an invisible gardener. So what else does he liken this process to, and how? Well, he likens it to sexual love, and some will think of sexual love purely as a biological, physical thing. It says here, one man talks about sexual behavior, the physical side of love. But others, he points out, thinks that perhaps sexual love, is a spiritual connection between two souls. And this is when he says here, another man prefers to talk of Aphrodite. Aphrodite is the Greek goddess of love. So how is this spiritual connection of souls useful in understanding Flew when he says the process of qualification, and we'll highlight that here, the process of qualification may be checked at any point? How does this spiritual connection of souls, how is it useful in understanding what he means by that? Well, it helps us understand Flew's point. One cannot scientifically detect a soul or a spiritual connection when you speak of one. Most people who speak of love in that spiritual, soulful connection in that way, they use the words symbolically. And Flew calls this checked. This is this word we just highlighted here, something which is checked. What does that mean? It means something which has been stopped. And stopped the process here of qualification that we just highlighted. In other words, the process of making the original assertion that you've made more complicated than it needs to be. So when people recognize that it isn't really a real thing, they stop the process of qualification, they check it, they stop it from becoming more and more complicated and convoluted as they would carry on speaking if they did. Now, what does Flew say religious people do instead? Well, he says that they simply don't check the process. They don't stop the original idea they had becoming more and more complicated. Instead, what they do is they keep on qualifying their idea of God rather than giving up on it. We see it here when Flew says, it is not always judiciously so halted. You can highlight that there. They don't stop it. Now, how might conspiracy theories and conspiracies like the modern day Illuminati, you can see the image there, illustrate this point that Flew is making? Well, modern day Illuminati conspiracy theorists are going to claim things like a secret organization is behind events like 9/11. But there is no proof that you can find that backs up their claim. Theorists will simply hold on to their belief regardless by qualifying it with things that they might say like, they are just hidden in society. They're a secret, unknowable, elite group. So you're never really going to be, of course you won't find evidence because they do these things secretly. And so they make their original assertion something that simply cannot be disproven. Now, what does Flew mean by his famous phrase at the end? The phrase we've already mentioned, a fine brash hypothesis may thus be killed by inches, the death by 1,000 qualifications. Well, if you qualify an idea so much that it can be never disproved, you end up killing it by making it meaningless. Now, it's actually, interestingly, a reference to an ancient form of execution in China known as lynching. And you can see the image there depicting what they used to do. It's a slow, slow death by receiving thousands of little cuts in the body. Not very pleasant. The English language uses that phrase in order to imply something is being destroyed in a slow, drawn-out way. Now, Flew says religious people do just that to their beliefs. Exactly the same thing that the Chinese did to their prisoners, killing them very, very slowly. Religious people are killing their beliefs very, very slowly. Now, Flew attacks liberal Christian theologians here, like Paul Tillich, who you can see on the left. You may remember studying him in religious language when you would have looked at things like symbolism. Now, Paul Tillich referred to God never as God, but as the ground of being. God is beyond all literal description, he said. By avoiding a literal interpretation of God and religious belief, they avoid criticisms by the likes of people like Immanuel Kant. So liberals avoid the literal interpretations of God. Now, what belief of Immanuel Kant that you've learnt in ethics might they be able to avoid? Well, if you remember, he discussed the phenomenal and the noumenal reality. Although we experience and describe the phenomenal reality, God is part of the noumenal reality, which is way beyond our knowledge, and that's something Kant said. Well, if you're a liberal believer, like Paul Tillich and some others, even John Hick, for example, you're going to be able to avoid Immanuel Kant's criticism. However, what would Antony Flew be accusing liberal thinkers here of doing? Well, he accuses them of committing their beliefs to a death by 1,000 qualifications. Now, what might fundamentalist Christians believe about Flew's parable here? We're going to watch a very short video of a Christian apologist, someone who spends their time defending their religion theologically, arguing that the parable of Flew attacks liberal Christianity, as we've mentioned, but not fundamentalist Christianity. Here's the clip.
Let's talk about the philosophers a little bit more. Give us the parable of Antony Flew and John Wisdom, that the philosophers, it's really a good illustration about the liberals who are talking about God, and they got nothing to talk about. I mean, it exposes them, but it's terrific for historic Christianity. Would you explain that parable and why that's so?
The analytical philosophers, John Wisdom and Antony Flew, developed a parable which they employ to show how nonsensical it is to talk about God. I think it's wonderful that one of these men is named John Wisdom. Makes you feel that the universe is not entirely in difficulty. Yes. In this parable, we have two explorers coming across a clearing in the jungle. Right? The clearing in the jungle represents some degree of order in this world. Right? And explorer says, there's a gardener who comes and takes care of this garden. The other says, there is no gardener. One of them represents a believer in God, the other represents an atheist. So, they sit down and they watch. No gardener is seen. They remember H.G. Wells' Invisible Man. So they put a barbed wire around the clearing and they electrify it to catch any invisible climber. But there is never any indication of anyone being there. They patrol it with bloodhounds, but the bloodhounds never give a cry. Finally, at the end, the believer says, but there is a gardener, invisible, intangible, insensible to electric shocks, and he comes and takes care of the garden which he loves. And the skeptic replies, but how does that kind of a gardener differ from an imaginary gardener or from no gardener at all. This parable is to show, presumably, that people who believe in God believe in something that suffers the death by 1,000 qualifications. God is not this, not that, not the other thing. There's never any evidence, and therefore believers in God might as well be believing in an imaginary God. Well, as you pointed out, John, that's exactly the mess that religious liberals get in.
Give them a few examples, like of Tillich's, et cetera, down the line.
Oh, yes. Well, Karl Barth, whom you mentioned previously, Karl Barth said the resurrection occurred, but it didn't occur in ordinary history, so it can't be investigated. Paul Tillich says that God is the ground of all being and also being itself. And so you're not sure whether you're looking at God when you shave in the morning and look in the mirror. You don't know what the ground of all being is. It can't be hamburger, but there's some sort of ground there. The whole thing is so indefinable and so vague, so untestable, that you actually don't end up with any sort of definable belief at all. The Eastern religions, in talking about Brahman is all, get into that same sort of difficulty. But historic Christianity, and this is the important point, historic Christianity is not in those categories, not in the slightest. Why? Because in historic Christianity, you don't need to set up a barbed wire fence. You don't need any bloodhounds. The gardener literally enters the garden. I think it's fascinating on Easter morning, the women thought they were seeing a gardener. That's the gardener of the Flew wisdom parable, everybody. Huh? The gardener came into this world, and he displayed himself by many infallible proofs.
And so there we have it, a Christian fundamentalist arguing that actually fundamental Christians, literal Christians, avoid Flew's parable because they're able to point out that God literally is the gardener who literally comes into the world in the person of Jesus Christ, if they're Christian, and acts. So it's only the liberal Christians that clearly are being affected here by the parable. So what might Flew say back in response to this Christian apologist, this fundamentalist? Well, Flew is simply going to say back that his parable is not just attacking liberal Christians, but he believes it is criticizing all religious believers. So let's move on. Flew thinks that he's identified the key problem with religious language. He believes it isn't falsifiable. He draws a distinction between liberal and traditional religious language. Although he doesn't call it by those names, we can decipher them in what he says. Now, what examples of religious propositions does Flew give to illustrate his point? Well, let's highlight some things here. The first is this: God has a plan. The second is God created the world. The third is God loves us as a father loves his children. These are three very clear, important examples that he gives of religious propositions to illustrate his point. Now, how does Flew describe these propositions? Well, he describes them as initially that's a very important word there, like assertions, or vast cosmological assertions, he goes on to say. These, in other words, he believes are being spoken of as though they were truth claims. But what does Flew say of these liberal interpretations of these ideas, such as God has a plan, God created the world, God loves us? If you have a liberal interpretation of these, like Tillich might, then what does Flew say? Well, he says that the liberal interpretation, such utterances, are crypto commands, expressions of wishes, disguised ejaculations, concealed ethics. Not particularly flattering. So how do you think Tillich, a liberal philosopher, might use and interpret these statements, God has a plan, or God created the world? Well, for example, God has a plan might be understood to mean that there is a moral order to the universe, not that he literally has a plan. Or when we say God created the world, it might be understood to mean that we must live as though we have a purpose for being here, not that he literally and directly created the world. So how does Flew describe those like Tillich who believe these sentences mean something differently? Well, beyond what we said a minute ago, he refers to them as unlikely to succeed in making them either properly orthodox or practically effective. He says that they are not properly orthodox. That means they're not genuine religion, or they're not practically effective, which means that most religious believers are probably not going to accept the views of Tillich. Like we heard in the video a moment ago, most fundamental literal Christians are not likely to accept these liberal statements or interpretations of the religious assertions. Now, Flew has dismissed the views of the liberals as not having much substance or use. So who is he now ultimately criticizing? Well, he's really criticizing the people that hold on to the traditional sense of these views. The reality of, for example, an omnipotent spirit, an all-powerful spirit that loves and that created the world. Now, if God has a plan, and let's go through these three statements briefly. If God has a plan, then there must be things that can go against his plan. If God created the world, then other theories about its origin must get ruled out. And if God loves us, then there must be some things that he won't allow to happen to us. Now, if this is not the case, if these three things are not the case, then what would that mean for these beliefs in God? Well, it would mean that if God's plan is that anything can happen, then it really isn't a plan after all. If any explanation of the origin of the world, for example, is compatible with God creating it, then it doesn't mean anything to say that God created it. And if God's love allows anything to happen, let's take the Holocaust, for example, then surely it isn't really love at all. Now, how did Darwin's theory of evolution split the liberals and the fundamentalists when it came out? Well, the fundamentalists believed the creation story in Genesis, and they will often still do today, that we were created, for example, over 6,000 years ago. And we can see here Darwin gave the evidence to show that we have evolved over millions of years from ape-like creatures. The crux, it says there, of Darwin's theory of evolution focuses on the elimination of inferior species gradually over time through a process called natural selection. Now, liberals accepted this change and changed their ideas about God as a creator. Either they would be saying that God used evolution to create the world, or, for example, that he didn't directly create the world, but he just allowed it to happen. Whereas fundamentalists rejected the science of Darwin and they kept the traditional view. So how does this show Flew is able to criticize all religious believers, both liberal and fundamentalist? Well, the liberals, and listen to this, the liberals are qualifying their original beliefs, whereas the fundamentalists still believe despite contradictory evidence. They will even go so far as to reject that dinosaurs existed. So both the liberals and the fundamentalists now still get criticized by Antony Flew, one for overqualifying their original beliefs and bringing great confusion, and watering everything down, and the other one for holding steadfast onto a view which has been contradicted by evidence. So moving on, Flew spells out the falsification principle without actually ever calling it that, and he describes how it applies to religious language. Now, which sentence here gives a clear summary of the falsification principle? It's right at the beginning. To assert that such and such is the case is necessarily equivalent to denying that such and such is not the case. There it is. That's his summary of the falsification principle. So what does this actually mean? Well, a statement that isn't denying anything isn't really claiming anything either. So what does Flew call these statements that make claims that might be true? He refers to them as assertions, asserting. We can see this word used often. Why doesn't Flew believe religious statements are assertions? Well, that's because religious statements are not actually saying anything that can be denied. What in essence then is Flew accusing religious statements of being? Well, he doesn't use this word, but he's effectively accusing religious statements of not being assertions, and therefore they are meaningless. Flew now challenges the other symposiasts, Hare and Mitchell, to answer his question. What would count for them as disproof of God? If the answer is nothing, then belief in God must be meaningless. So what's the example Flew uses to challenge them with? Let's highlight the example. We see a child dying of inoperable cancer of the throat. That's his analogy. Now, despite the earthly father, it says here, driven frantic in his efforts to help, so his earthly father is concerned, what does Flew say of God? Well, he says his heavenly father reveals no obvious sign of concern. Yet, what is it that religious believers claim to know about God? Well, they claim that God loves us as a father. And we can see that here. So what comparison and point is Flew making when he uses this analogy? Well, if an earthly father didn't love their child in this way, their love would be disproved. No one would believe it. Therefore, why do religious believers not then apply this same principle to God? If it seems the Heavenly Father reveals no obvious sign of concern, surely we can resign to the idea that their love has been disproved. God's love has been falsified. Now, what other topics studied that you've looked at in the AS part of the course does this link to? Well, it links to the problem of evil and suffering. Now, what two explanations for God's apparent lack of concern does Flew suggest religious believers will offer? Well, the first explanation that they might offer is that God does love us, but his love is not a merely human love. We see that there. For example, God may want the child to be with him in heaven. The second kind of explanation Flew argues that religious people may give for God's apparent lack of concern is this: that God does love us, but his love is an inscrutable, and we can see this word here, an inscrutable love. Inscrutable means impossible to make sense of. And this love here, he is testing the faith of the family, maybe, or perhaps he's punishing them for their sins. But either way, the religious believer gives an explanation that could come in the form of those two. Now, does Flew argue with these claims? And who would? Well, it's very clear. Flew doesn't try and argue with the claims of religious people. He doesn't address the claims, he just points out what they would say. But there is a scholar that you will have studied that does argue with these claims, and you can find that by looking at Mackey's anthology for the Edexcel course. That would be from his essay, Evil and Omnipotence. Now, what question does Flew raise here instead? He says this: just what would have to happen, not merely to tempt, but also to entitle us to say God does not love us, or even God does not exist? What will it take, he says. Now, what effectively is Flew concluding here at the end about religious believers? that maintain the idea that God is love regardless of what happens. Well, we said it before, he doesn't use the word, but his conclusion here is that it means the belief becomes meaningless. So what might count against the loving God? Let's think about that for a moment. Well, there's a very big, obvious picture here that you could use as an example. What about a meteor hitting and destroying planet Earth? Maybe that would count against the loving God. Well, since it hasn't happened yet, maybe we should consider some actual events that are less extreme than that have already occurred. Let's take on the left-hand side there of that picture, the Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews murdered. Or on the right-hand side, we may take the Black Death that wiped out a third of Europe in the 13th century. Have these events caused the world to give up belief in God, however? Well, some people will have given up their belief in God. Certainly some Jewish people did. But the beliefs still remain. Religion is still very strong around the world. Now, according to Antony Flew, if the Quran was found to be older than the Prophet Muhammad, or if they found Jesus in the Christian faith buried and his bones present today, how would the falsification principle be applied according to Flew? Well, it would say that religious beliefs about the resurrection of Jesus and about the revelation of the Quran on the night of power, Laylat al-Qadr, they could be falsified and therefore considered meaningful statements. Now, don't forget that point. If you can falsify the claim, it's meaningful. If you can't, it's meaningless. So if this kind of evidence existed, what would Flew say religious believers are going to do? Well, he would say, based on his parable, that they would carry on believing despite the disproof. Fundamentalists would deny that the evidence was real for Jesus's bones in the tomb. And the liberals, they would just qualify their original beliefs about the resurrection or the revelation of Muhammad. Now, one criticism here might be that if you rewrite Flew's parable and switch around the explorers so that the skeptic is the one having to qualify their belief, there is no gardener, and the believer is able to question how the invisible gardener is different from a real gardener, what could you argue about assertions by atheists in this case? Well, we'll revisit this a little bit later with the actual scholar, but we could then argue that atheist beliefs are non-falsifiable. What would count as disproof of the belief that there is no God? Surely atheist statements would then become meaningless as they constantly pick holes in every theist argument. And Hare deals with this next. So a little bit of context to Richard Hare. Hare responds to Flew's challenge to explain how religious language might be meaningful even if it isn't falsifiable. He introduces the concept of bliks, which are unfalsifiable but meaningful ideas. He uses a parable of his own, which we call the parable of the lunatic, to illustrate his idea of a blik. So we look at the first section here of Hare's response. Hare begins with the parable of the lunatic. At first glance, his parable seems to back up Antony Flew's point about religious statements being meaningless, but there is a big difference, he points out. Now, what kind of belief does Hare's parable describe? Well, his parable describes an unfalsifiable belief. There's a phrase that's used, it's an old-fashioned phrase, in his parable. He refers to dons in the parable, and a don is a senior lecturer, usually at Oxford or Cambridge University. And it's an interesting point to note some context here that Richard Hare was one at Oxford. Now, what does the student in the parable think that the dons are trying to do? Well, he thinks that they're trying to murder him, to kill him. What can none of his friends do when they speak to him about this situation? Well, none of them can convince him that he is wrong about his lecturers. It says here his friends introduce him to all the mildest and most respectable dons in the university. But after each one, they say, he doesn't really want to murder you. Surely you're convinced now. But the lunatic replies, yes, and then he qualifies it. So we're going to move on to look at that in a moment. But they just can't convince him. Now, why is this an unfalsifiable belief? It's unfalsifiable because it says here that they are plotting to kill him. Plotting to kill him. Plotting against me the whole time. And actually, the friendliness of the don, of the lecturer, is simply, he says, diabolical cunning. So despite how friendly his dons are to him, what does the student believe? Well, the statement, he's really plotting against me the whole time, explains that. The statement is one that cannot be proven false to someone who is paranoid or is a lunatic, out of their right mind. Now, Hare applied Flew's falsification principle to the student's statement. What's the conclusion he draws? This is the conclusion. The student, he says, asserts nothing. The student asserts nothing. You can see that down here. Therefore, his belief should be considered meaningless. However, what does Hare say is different about the lunatic student as opposed to the rest of us who are sane? All of his friends around him, perhaps, that were sane. Well, there is clearly a difference, because we've just heard how Flew's falsification principle, if applied, would argue that the statement is meaningless. Here, there is a difference. It affects the way the student behaves. So this lunatic, this insane student who believes his lecturers are out to kill him, may start avoiding lectures in order to not be killed. And this in turn will affect the behavior of the dons, of the lecturers. They may become very concerned about the student. They may expel him from university. And we read here, otherwise we should not call him a lunatic and ourselves sane. This shows it means something to us. It means something. Now, even though Hare is a Christian, he isn't trying to defend Christianity here. What makes this obvious in his parable? And what do the characters represent? Well, let's go to the very top of this section. I wish to make it clear that I shall not try to defend Christianity in particular, but religion in general. Not because I do not believe in Christianity, but because you cannot understand what Christianity is until you've understood what religion is. So the lunatic in the parable is the religious believer. And the paranoid belief he has in the don is the same as one in God. So religious belief then, according to Hare in the parable, is a delusion. Now, what is Hare's point then, if he isn't going to be very helpful to religious believers, who he himself is one, but he seems to put himself in a slightly strange position when he's arguing here? Well, he's saying that even the beliefs of a lunatic are meaningful in some way. They show us things about their state of mind, or they tell us what they might go on to do. So they're useful, they're meaningful in what they say. So what is Hare laying the foundations for here in his argument? Well, Hare is laying the groundwork to argue that meaningful belief needs to include more than just being falsifiable, which is what Flew thinks. Therefore, a non-falsifiable belief can still be meaningful. So, Flew's definition of meaningful, according to Hare, is simply too strict. Moving on, Hare explains in this section the difference between the lunatic and the ordinary people by introducing the idea of bliks. These are worldviews which are meaningful but unverifiable and unfalsifiable. So let's start with simply what is a blik? Well, a blik is a worldview. Possibly this has links to the Dutch word which means to look or to glance. It might simply be a made-up word by Hare, we're not quite sure. But it is logically prior to the facts. Bliks are always before the facts, logically. So we all start, in other words, with our own blik, and it tells us how we're going to interpret the world we encounter, what is fact and what those facts mean. Who does Hare say has bliks? Well, Hare argues that everyone has bliks. He says here, it is important to realize that we have a sane one, not no blik at all. So everybody has them. It is important to note that one cannot contradict a blik with more facts. So what people do is that they select the facts that verify or support their blik, and then they selectively ignore or explain away the facts that falsify it, that go against their bliks. So what does Hare say of everyone? Well, he says that we all have bliks and that we all support them with selective facts, and we ignore the evidence which doesn't suit our blik. So what example of a blik does Hare use to argue this? Well, he uses the example of a blik that you might have that says driving is always safe. So what enables Hare here to continue driving despite having the idea of knowledge that there are accidents which happen? Well, the blik itself, that driving is safe, means that knowledge of an accident doesn't actually challenge the blik that he has at all. He writes this, "It sometimes occurs to me to wonder whether my movements of the steering wheel will always continue to be followed by corresponding alterations in the direction of the car. I just have a blik," he goes on to say, "about steel and its properties, so that normally I trust the steering of my car." Now, what if Hare had the opposite blik about driving? What if he believed that driving was not safe? Well, then he would never get in the car if he thought that driving wasn't safe. No matter how many safe journeys he saw other people take, it wouldn't convince him. And he says that here, I should never go in a motor car. Nothing will count to disproving a blik. Where does Hare suggest that no evidence could ever falsify a blik? It's when he says at the bottom here, "For my blik is compatible with any finite number of such tests. Nothing counts to disproving a blik." So let's consider an alternative parable. And we did mention at the end of Flew's section the counter-argument to his parable. Now, the scholar that actually came up with this was John Frame, who you can see pictured there. And this is actually taken from J.W. Montgomery's symposium, God's Inerrant Word, which is a publication earlier on. Now, he doesn't use the word blik, but how does this support Hare's view? Well, in Frame's version of the parable, his alterations to Flu's parable, it is the skeptic who refuses to believe in the gardener despite all of the evidence. Now, if belief in God is a blik, then so is atheism. They don't allow their atheist blik to be falsified in the same way. You can see here, then the skeptic tries a last resort. Our senses are deceiving us. There is no gardener, no blooms, no palace, no officials. It's still a hoax. Finally, the believer despairs. But what remains of your original assertion? Just how does this mirage, as you call it, differ from a real God? So he switched the whole parable around. So we can now switch it on the atheist. If belief in God is a blik, then so is atheism. They don't allow their atheist blik to be falsified in the same way. So what other words are similar to blik that we might be familiar with? Well, if you think to Wittgenstein's language games, those are bliks. Or in the study of sociology, the word ideologies, these are people's bliks. Or in religion, we may substitute the word blik for faith. So what other examples of bliks are there that we have which work both ways? So let's take these two examples in front of us. Planes. Purposely chosen the Malaysian airline there, as we know there have been some really horrific, unfortunate accidents of the Malaysian aircraft, and conspiracy theories that have gone with them, as some have gone missing. Now, if we have a blik that flying is safe, or a blik that flying isn't safe, or if we have a blik with dogs that dogs are friendly, and a blik that says dogs are aggressive, they work both ways. If, as I do, I believe dogs are really friendly. I grew up with dogs. I love dogs. If I see a dog somewhere, I will go and stroke the dog. I will pat the dog on the head. But I have a member of my family who is petrified of dogs. And that was because the blik that the member of my family has toward dogs comes from an unfortunate experience when they were younger, of an aggressive dog. How might bliks work in the same way as tuning into news stations on a television? Well, when we tune into a news station, whether it's the BBC or CNN or Fox or Bloomberg or whatever it might be, we only ever tune into one station. We don't tune into all of them at once, even if we could, because it would be confusing. However, when focusing on one news station, what happens is we miss out then on the other news stations, and then we don't get to see all the angles or all the stories that are happening. Now we may wonder about insane bliks, known as delusions, or evil bliks, such as racism. What about these? If bliks cannot be falsified, how do we deal with evil or insane bliks in other people? Well, evil bliks like racism, so for example, every time someone sees a black person arrested for a crime, it may reinforce their blik that all black people are criminals. For those with non-racist bliks, no matter how many black people they see commit a crime, it would never change their view that black people are not all criminals. Now, we don't simply really know the answer to the question here in this text as to how we're going to deal with people that have evil or insane bliks. Hare does not address what we would do. But can people's bliks change? Well, yes, it seems they can. People convert to religions. They overcome their fear of dogs. They overcome their fear of flying. Rarely are they, however, argued into changing their bliks. Now, religious experiences, how do bliks link to those and the problem of evil? Well, religious experiences are bliks, some may argue. And good and evil are also bliks. You can have a good blik, an evil blik. You can have a moral blik, as Hare mentions a little bit later on. And so with those links to some of your work in the AS part of the course, we move on here. Although David Hume never used the word blik, Hare links the idea that he has to David Hume's theory of knowledge, in particular, the problem of induction, which you should be familiar with. Now, what is Hume famous for? Well, Hume is famous for his skepticism. He believed that all knowledge should be doubted. What does Hare rather, remind us that David Hume tried to do in his treatise of human nature? And you can see an image there of that very well-known work of David Hume. Well, Hume tries doubting everything at first. And this is giving us a little insight into David Hume at the moment. So Hume tries doubting everything. We can read that here, where we highlight, having performed the interesting experiment of doubting the ordinary man's blik about the world, and showing that no proof could be given to make us adopt one blik rather than another. You see, the reality of the world and others and the memories and the future, everything Hume starts to try and doubt. And he does this almost experimentally. And he posits this idea in his work, A Treatise of Human Nature. So imagine trying to doubt the reality of the world, the reality of your friends, the reality of your memories, the reality of what may happen in the future. What do we call this in philosophy? We call this idea total skepticism. Now, if this position is adopted, then you can find no good reason to believe anything. So what does David Hume do about this and why? Well, interestingly, it says here, he turned to backgammon to take his mind off the problem. He simply turns to a game of backgammon. You can see the image there of backgammon. It's an ancient board game. Now, by doing so, David Hume takes his mind off what is referred to here by Hare as the strained and ridiculous questioning. And so we can see that here. If we read a quote directly from A Treatise of Human Nature, I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, and when after 3 or 4 hours of amusement, I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous, and there it is, that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any farther. Hume takes his mind off the strained and ridiculous questioning of the foundational beliefs that he has of the world that cannot be verified or falsified. That's what he does and why he does it. Now, what's an example of one of these bliks that David Hume alludes to? Well, the blik of induction. Normal blik about the world, the blik of induction, of drawing conclusions from factual experience. Hume alludes to this. It's needed for science to test hypotheses, inductive reasoning. Now, what is Hume's problem with inductive arguments? Remember, Hare draws upon David Hume's problem of induction here. Well, David Hume says that they assume that the things that have been experienced in the past will be repeated in the future. People base their predictions of the future on the things of the past. But the problem is it has no rational basis. We could take the idea that all swans are white, which was a famous idea that got debunked because all the Europeans used to believe that all swans were white until some of them went across to Australia and they saw a black swan. And that debunked the theory of the past. Their past experience used to predict that all things were white that was swan, but actually it turned out they were wrong, because it's an irrational thing to do. Now, what is David Hume's solution to the problem of induction? Well, he doesn't actually have one, but he says that we have a habit of expecting the future to resemble the past. And despite that being irrational, we still do it. Now, in summary, if David Hume is right about all of this that we've just looked at, what is Richard Hare suggesting? Well, Richard Hare is using this to suggest that bliks are the basis for all of our thinking. Not just religious or insane thoughts, but everything. What does Hare do in the very below paragraph here? And what does he introduce? Well, he summarizes the examples that we've already looked at. And he used these earlier, didn't he? And he introduces the idea of a moral blik. He says this: if I continue to do what is right according to my lights, in the general likelihood of people like Hitler coming to a bad end. He's alluding to the idea of goodness being rewarded and bad people like Hitler getting what they deserve. This is the idea of a moral blik. We can see the summary as well in his discussion again about his car. Now, using the psalm, using this psalm right at the bottom of this bit of the text, what does Richard Hare think is weak, and what does he think the pillars are? This is the quote from the Psalms in the Bible, or the Torah. The earth is weak. I bear up the pillars of it. Well, he's actually given a very unique interpretation of this particular scripture. Typically speaking, the earth is weak and everyone that lives in it is weak, but God is the one that holds everything together. But actually, he has this particular take on it. He argues that what is weak is human knowledge, and that the pillars are actually the bliks, which are our foundational beliefs, which hold everything firm and together. Now, without the pillars, without the bliks, we would know nothing. The blik, like God, however, is beyond being proved or disproved. Now, where else is David Hume's problem of induction found in the AS content that you've studied? Well, you should remember that you will find it in religious experience, you'll find it in the design argument, you'll find it in the cosmological argument. What problems in philosophy are there with foundational knowledge? This is all of our knowledge which is true as it is based on something else that we know to be true. So if we claim our knowledge is true because it's based on something else which we already know to be true. So what problems in philosophy are there with having foundational knowledge? Well, there are some foundational statements we know to be true without needing to base them on anything else. There's an infinite regress of knowledge, perhaps, with no foundation needed for it at all. So like the cosmological argument, with the causes and the motion to the universe, we could end up arguing that they have a cause that goes back forever. Do we need foundational statements in knowledge? And if so, what should they be? What then are bliks? Well, this is highly debated in philosophy, whether we actually need them or not. Bliks here then seem to be foundational statements about the universe. And so this would be a criticism of Hare, to argue that maybe we don't need them after all. And if we don't need foundational statements always, then are bliks even a thing to be necessary? What did Immanuel Kant say about knowledge? And what does that mean for bliks? Well, do you remember, he said in your studies in ethics We can only know the phenomenal reality, the things from sense experience, but we can't know the noumenal reality. And this is why we can never know what is a right or what is a wrong blik that Hare mentions, as there are no evidence or facts that will ever be accepted as proof or disproof. Let's think about John Hick for a minute. How does his pluralistic hypotheses deal with diversity of religious experiences which make it difficult to accept that all of them are true encounters of the divine? And how can this be related to bliks? Well, John Hick says that all religious experiences are genuine encounters, but they are interpreted differently. You may recall the parable of the blind men and the elephant, which illustrates this point. John Hick would argue that all religious experiences are therefore bliks, as they cannot be fully grasped by the human mind. Different traditions will give their interpretations. None will cancel out the others. All of them become valid insights. And therefore, like bliks, they are not falsified by religious experience from a different faith. So moving on, Hare explains how his idea of bliks deals with Flew's criticism of religious language. He suggests that Flew has misunderstood what religious statements really are. Flew is treating them as scientific propositions when Hare believes they are nothing of the sort. So what does Flew criticize religious statements for not being? Well, he criticizes them for not being falsifiable, remember, and therefore he claims they are meaningless. What is Hare's response to this? Well, Hare says that they don't have to be falsifiable to be meaningful, remember. So what kind of statements need to be falsifiable according to Richard Hare? He says scientific ones. We can highlight that here as some sort of explanation, as scientists are accustomed to using the word. What does Hare believe about treating religious statements as though then they are scientific ones? Well, he says this: it would obviously be ludicrous. It would be silly, because they are not assertions about facts. They are expressions of a non-falsifiable worldview, of a non-falsifiable blik. Now, interestingly, Hare refers to the god Atlas. Let's have a look at it here. We no longer believe in God as an Atlas. Why is he talking about this? Well, in the ancient Greek world, in ancient Greek, there was a titan called Atlas, who actually, it was believed that Atlas literally supported the sky, as you can see in that image there, on his shoulders. Now, it seemed scientific, but it can be proven false. And Richard Hare admits that there may have been, in the past, like this, in ancient Greek mythology, Hare admits that there may have been religious beliefs in the past that were intended to be factual propositions, like the god Atlas. But he says this is no longer the case. Things have changed. How does Richard Hare then show how different the modern religious God then has become compared to the ancient belief in gods that we've just looked at? So the God of Christianity, of Judaism, of Islam. How does Hare show these modern ideas about God are different? Well, we can see a picture there of Laplace and Napoleon. He quotes the French astronomer Pierre-Simon Laplace. And you can see that here as we highlight it. And this is what he said. Nous avons pas besoin de principauté. I had no need of that hypothesis. Very famous phrase. Now, Laplace showed a model of the solar system to Napoleon. And when Napoleon asked where God fitted into the model of the planets orbiting the sun, this was his response. I had no need of that hypothesis. In other words, Laplace said you don't need a literal God to explain the movements of the planets around the sun. So how does Hare use Laplace to highlight Antony Flew's mistake? Well, he's saying that atheists like Antony Flew make the mistake of Napoleon, of thinking of God as the answer to scientific problems. Why is Richard Hare being clever in using a quote from Laplace? Well, this is because, you may not know this, but this quote is used usually by atheists, as it suggests that God has become redundant. But here, Richard Hare is suggesting atheists like Antony Flew have a redundant view of God that Christians have modernized. They've moved on. So what is Hare's final example of a blik then? It's this. Suppose we believed that everything that happened by pure chance. No God, no order, no laws of nature, just random events. Random events. And therefore, we should not be able to explain or predict or plan anything. Nothing can verify, nothing can falsify the belief. So how is this belief similar to David Hume before he played the game of backgammon, when he was experimenting with that idea of doubt? Well, if everything is chance, there's simply no point in trying to plan or trying to understand anything. It would change the way that you lived your life if you believed that kind of way. So how does Richard Hare think that this is similar to religious belief? Well, a religious blik says that the world is the creation of a loving God. It cannot be verified, it cannot be falsified, but it will make a difference to how you live your life. So, how is Hare's view of bliks an anti-realist challenge to religious language? Well, he denies that religious statements are factual. They're simply expressions of a blik, of a worldview. That's how his view of bliks are an anti-realist challenge. Now, Flew might argue that religious statements are meant as realist, as factual ones. Why might some religious people, some theists, agree with Flew? Well, for many, God exists as a statement is far more than just a blik or a worldview. It's a claim about a supernatural being, a divine being, which could be false. Why might many atheists and religious believers disagree with Richard Hare? And who else might fundamentalist believers reject? Well, they would claim their beliefs really are, as we highlighted earlier, explanations as scientists are accustomed to use the word. People, for example, like Hick or Tillich, the fundamentalist believers might reject. So actually, many atheists and religious believers both could disagree with Hare here. How far are atheist beliefs a picture preference in the same way Flew says of religious believers? And this has taken us back to that phrase I asked you to remember earlier of a picture preference. Remember, a picture preference is saying that it's in your imagination. Well, Richard Hare certainly seems to be implying this, that atheist beliefs are imaginative in the same way that Flew speaks of that of religious believers. There's no difference, he would think. Moving on, Hare concludes by saying that as far as their bliks go, modern atheists and liberal religious believers may not be all that different after all. However, he does warn that abandoning the religious blik for something truly different might be very dangerous. So what is Hare suggesting about many atheists and their upbringing here? Well, he's saying that they haven't really left behind their religious blik of the religion of their upbringing. We can read that here when he says, when people have had a good Christian upbringing, as have most of those who now profess not to believe in any sort of religion. And that's right at the top here. Now, what have non-believers then abandoned? We go back to this phrase again. Non-believers have abandoned the more picturesque fringes of religion. And there it is there. Richard Hare could be thinking of images here like the devil with pitchforks or angels greeting you in heaven. Many liberal thinkers have also abandoned these picturesque ideas. So what kind of blik is it that Richard Hare thinks non-believers share with believers like him? Well, he says this. In fact, they still have got, and could not live without, a religion of a comfortably substantial, albeit highly sophisticated kind. He's thinking of morality here. Good is important, and bad things come to an end, like we heard earlier with Hitler. There is a purpose to life. Being kind would be the key to living a good life, etc. These are the things he believes are the kind of bliks that non-believers share with believers like him. Now, what does Hare say is the only major difference then between them? Well, quite comically, almost, he says that religious people like to sing psalms about theirs. Hymns. Believers like to sing hymns, and atheists don't. That's the only thing he thinks there is a clear difference there between them. Now, what might one of the different directions be that Hare suggests non-believers go down? And we see this phrase here, are walking in different directions. Well, we're going to infer a little bit here based on things he said before, but based on his previous mention of Hitler, he could be alluding to immorality, things like the Nazis when they lost sight of humanity. This perhaps could be the major difference, or one of the different directions that Hare suggests non-believers will go down without a religious blik. Now, what did Hare mean then when he said this? Man has not changed biologically since primitive times. And there we can highlight it there. Man has not changed biologically since primitive times. Well, humans have still got evil urges that have been based on hate, on fear, on a lust for power. That's what he meant when he said that. So what is Hare implying that a religious blik will offer? Well, he's effectively saying that having a religious blik will restrain you from these immoral behaviors. And we can highlight this bit here, and it can easily change again. Weirdly, why does Hare compare Sikhs and Muslims here? We see this right at the end. He says, some Sikhs and some Muslims of the same Punjabi stock. It's an old term, by the way, Muslims, for Muslims. You will find them quite different sorts of people. In other words, you're going to find them racially and culturally similar, but they have different religious bliks because they have very different religions. It's unclear, however, why Hare uses these examples, and not necessarily to his advantage, as we'll see towards the end. Now, on the right, you can see a picture of Braithwaite. And he argues, like Hare, that the falsification principle cannot be applied to religious statements in the same way as it can to scientific statements, since religious language is, he said, prescriptive. Now, think back to your meta-ethics in A2. In what way, drawing from your A2 ethics, can you see this? Well, religious language recommends a way of behaving, he would say. Like moral language, religious language guides behavior and prescribes or recommends a way of living. Take the phrase God, or the statement, God loves me. This has meaning to it, he would say, because it prescribes you to live your life in a loving way. Why might this be considered to be a form of religious humanism? If you didn't hear that phrase before, you've never heard it, this is what it means. Religious humanism says that religion is all about having a set of positive, moral, and cultural values, and that's what makes up religion. Now, this is something that Hare must be. He must be a religious humanist. How far would religious believers accept the only thing that separates them from atheists, that Hare says, is the fact that they like to sing hymns? Probably not very many. Even within religions themselves, there are very big differences. Just take Sunni and Shia in Islam, Protestant and Catholic in Christianity. And does Hare contradict himself when he compares Sikhs with Muslims? And what problem does this pose? Well, it would seem so. Now, either people from different religions or none at all can share basic bliks about life, or they have different bliks that affect the way that they live. Surely it has to be one or the other. Hare seems to contradict himself. So which one does he advocate? It's a little bit confusing. How does the ecumenical movement in the Christian faith rely on sharing all together the same blik? Well, the ecumenical movement enables different Christian denominations to work together. It's believed to have begun by the Roman Catholic Church. And Thésée in France was a very big part of its development. But it enables Christians of all different denominations to come together and work together. And so it perhaps argues that there is such a thing as sharing the same blik. But at this stage, let's consider what atheists like Richard Dawkins, as you can see here, would say, in order to show that a religious blik is actually very different from a scientific blik, and is contrary to the ideas that Hare is putting forward here. So let's have a watch of something that Dawkins would say.
We have the privilege of being in this universe for a few decades. And during that time, it is an enormous privilege to be able to understand something about the universe in which we live, why we're here, why we were ever born, where we come from. And I think that is such a wonderful thing to be able to do, that I am hostile, I can get angry about competing accounts which seem to me to not encourage that kind of questioning, but instead to say, this is how it is, it's all written in the Holy Book, it was written 2,000 years ago, and that's the end of it. I think that deprives people. I think that is such a belittling, a demeaning view of the universe, and I think it's tragic that children are brought up with that when they could be brought up in a more open-minded way. So that's one reason for the anger. The other reason it is that I do think that faith, unsupported by evidence, is a lethal weapon. Well, it doesn't have to be, of course it doesn't have to be, but it can be. It's a weapon because possibly unscrupulous people can get hold of often young men and use them as weapons, use them as human bonds. The only reason they can be deployed as human bonds is that they have been brought up from childhood onwards to believe implicitly, without question, that whatever the particular religion is, the details don't matter. The point is that they do believe that it is the will of God that they should detonate themselves and blow up a busload of people or blow up a skyscraper in New York. I don't think that any kind of reasoned argument would do that to people. And so I believe that religion, religious faith, is an enormously powerful psychological weapon. It isn't always used for the bad, of course, but the fact that it can be used for the bad makes me want to cut it off at the roots, and at the very least to stop the inculcation into children of the idea that there is something virtuous in faith. I'm very concerned with the way children coming into the world innocent and knowing nothing are taken over by the religion of whatever culture they happen to be born into. It doesn't happen to everybody, but it's very common. And so you see children being labelled. This is a Catholic child, this is a Protestant child. I would much rather say this is a child. Perhaps you could say this is a child of Catholic parents, or this is a child of Protestant parents. But to tie a label around a tiny child, this is a Catholic child, when the child is clearly too young to know what it thinks about the transubstantiation, or whatever it is that differentiates Catholics from Protestants.
And so we come to the end. Hare concludes by offering a thoughtful contrast between his idea of Bliks and Flew's parable of the gardener. What about Flew's parable does Hare say is a poor analogy for comparing religious belief and atheism? Well, the explorers in the parable are not personally involved in whether the gardener exists or not. He says that they're just simply curious. We can find that here. The explorers do not mind about their garden. They discuss it with interest, but not with concern. So what is different with the student in Hare's parable of the lunatic as he compares them? Well, the student is personally involved in whether the dons want to murder him. But my lunatic, he says, poor fellow, minds about the dons. He cares. So why does Hare think the blik about driving, being safe, shows concern? Well, Hare will care about the answer because he says it often has people in it that I care for. There are people in the vehicle, or he will care for other people as they get into cars and drive. So for Richard Hare, what plays a very big role in the bliks? Well, it's the fact that we care about them being true. We base our life on it because these are foundational beliefs. They give us meaning. Why does Hare mind very much about what goes on in the garden? He says here, I mind very much about what goes on in the garden. Well, he's saying that he cares about what is going on in the world and about whether there is a God. What's he unable to be about the world and God then? He says he cannot be detached. He says here, I am unable to share the explorer's detachment, which he derives from Flew's parable. Therefore, what would he say about scientific questions as opposed to religious questions? He would say that one can be detached about scientific questions, therefore one can apply the falsification principle to see if statements are meaningful. But when it comes to religious questions, you're never detached. And so the falsification principle simply doesn't apply. Why might some people disagree with Richard Hare that you cannot be detached about religious questions? Well, you might be able to ask about the existence of God from a scientifically curious point of view, not actually caring if the answer is going to be true or false. If you think back to religious experience, William James investigates religious experience in this particular way. He does it as a pragmatist. He doesn't judge whether they are objectively true or simply subjective feelings. He leaves that judgment aside. Now, what, however, might cause people to agree with Hare that it is impossible to be detached about religious questions? Well, if God exists, there might be a heaven or a hell to go to. Nobody wants to miss out on the reward of heaven or the experience, or to avoid experiencing the torture of hell. And so that may cause many people to not become detached about religious questions. They're invested in wanting to find out more. Also, religious experiences have very life-changing impacts upon people. They're not simply curious or just interesting experiences that people talk about. People refer to them in a way in which suggests they have a lasting impact. And finally, there's an Australian philosopher called Howard Horsper who argues that religious bliks are always, he believes, the insane ones that Hare refers to in his parable, rather than the sane bliks that Hare distinguishes. They start, he says, as assertions, but pretend to become bliks when they get falsified. Now, if this is true, what do we do with Hare's response to Flew? Well, what we can do is we can look to Basil Mitchell in the next part of the symposium.